Okay, good afternoon, beautiful people. Welcome to Kiko's Freethinkers Forum. We are at episode 15. I can't believe that we made it to 15 episodes. I have a very special guest with me this afternoon. Her name is Sarah Ohmer, and she is an assistant professor of Latin American Studies, African American Studies, and Women's Studies at Lehman College in the Bronx, New York. She received her PhD in Hispanic Languages and Literatures at the University of Pittsburgh and focuses on gender, race, and trauma of Black women authors. And I love it that we have some shared interests. I work with primarily men, but I do work with the theme of trauma as well. So I'm sure that we will talk about that some today in our interview. She has several publications in outlets such as the Journal of International Women's Studies and Polora, the publication of the Afro-Latin American Literature Research Association. We will specifically discuss two articles. I'm really intrigued by these articles. One is In the Beginning Was Body Language, Clowning and Crump as Spiritual Healing and Resistance. I didn't even know what crump was. I had to look it up. And then the other article in particular that I wanted to pinpoint was The Making and Silencing of Asheocracy. And you may have to explain what Ashe is to the audience, Asheocracy in Brazil. And we're going to talk about the parallels of Blackness in Brazil, the United States, some more trauma discussion, women authors, Black women authors in the region. Welcome to the show, and thanks for accepting that invitation.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited. It's so nice to hear my bio played back at me too.
I know it's an extensive one. Let me tell you, it's I'm impressed by your work.
Now I'm associate professor now.
You're associate. See, I knew it was something I was going to ask you. Oh my gosh, I should have verified that before, but it's okay.
I love it.
Official. She is an associate professor. My bad, not an assistant, but an associate professor. And congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And just to put in a plug for the pod, our audience is growing big time, especially on TikTok. We're also available on YouTube and most podcasting platforms. It's an educational platform. If you followed the previous episodes, there can be episodes that make you question things a lot, but that's the point of the podcast. It's a podcast that goes against the grain. It's a culture and a political podcast at the same time. And so I think different types of audiences can gain the benefit from it. And I think that's what it's about. I think more than ever now we need to be more open-minded and exchange and dialogue with different types of people. And I think in our field, Sarah, in our field in particular, it encourages that we understand that we have to confront different types of intersectionalities of people. And so we have less issues with that. I think it's a matter of bringing other people on board and maybe learning from us, and we may learn from them as well. But I wanted to actually start with you, Sarah. I always ask all my guest members, what's some of your background? What got you into foreign languages in the culture? Like, where you're from? Like, how did this journey start with Sarah Ohmer?
Oh, I love this question. It's a great question to explore too, I think, for your audience, for people who don't necessarily think of studying a language as a gateway to a career. Languages is usually just that requirement that you just procrastinate to take to the very end. If you have the privilege of going through college, or it's a class that maybe you took in middle school or high school or part of a heritage month, at a school. I was always drawn to languages I didn't speak. Probably because of how I was raised. My dad is French and my mom is from Madagascar. So I didn't get to learn her language, but I learned a few words. I was exposed to the music. And then I moved to the United States at 11. And at the time, what they offered, I was in Texas, what they offered was ESL classes. So, I got into second language acquisition very early. If we have any linguistic listeners, they'll know that's the critical period age, right? So it's a good time to learn a new language. So that's why I sound like I'm native.
Yeah.
then I remember actually it was in middle school in 7th grade, and then I'll flip over to, how I got to this field. But in 7th grade, I was past the ESL. You had like a chunk of your day that was just learning English, isolated from everyone else at school. And then so the only classes you could take were math and maybe history, or I can't remember, or band, I can't remember. And then I graduated from that, and I was able to take more classes with all the regular classes, and I got to take Spanish, and it felt good because it was the one thing I was good at. With the French, I just picked up the Spanish language so easily, and I just was very curious at that age about the culture, the different countries that spoke that language. And I ended up taking Spanish throughout, and in college, and I majored in it, I think, just because it was something that I already knew. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it. But then I had to study abroad. Everybody has this, right? Like the study abroad experience. So then I had a study abroad experience. I got to Mexico, and I started to read magical realism. And it just,
okay.
it opened like something in me, that just made me really want to dig in and understand. And that's when I started to be intrigued by collective trauma. It was Pedro Paramo and thinking about the Mexican Revolution and the way, the whole country was in crisis, but also the author and the way that was represented in the book. And it just made me think about culture and literature and politics and healing from trauma. And then when I got into my master's, I kind of stuck with that curiosity and started to look at women's narratives. I had one professor that just was a fierce feminist advocate and pushed me to focus on the perspective of women or what women are writing. Mm-hmm. So then the big influence in my master's was Gloria Anzaldúa. I took a class on border thinking, and got to read Gloria Anzaldúa. And then that was the other big opening for me, realizing that you can write in more than one language, and theorize with poetry and with the way your story lives in your body, and engage with your personal history and cultural history, and still engage with bigger questions that the country was going through in the United States at the time, but also Chicano culture was going through at the time. And then Anzaldúa, with her gender, sexuality, her race, her social class, socioeconomic status, just everything just put together made it just like this beautiful tapestry. I couldn't stop staring at it, and I wanted to figure out how to weave my own, yeah. And so that got me to every step of the way in my career, I've had mentors that have seen something in me, and I'm sure our listeners of African descent or people of color, women, girls, can relate, or anybody that's been oppressed in any way can relate, where people saw something in me that I did not see in myself, and we're trying to get that out of me, and and motivate me to just go a little further, go a little further, go a little further. And that's how I ended up in a doctoral program. I never thought, I always wanted to teach, but I never thought I would go into a PhD program. I certainly didn't think I could write 200 plus pages on spirituality and trauma in literature in Latin America. I get a degree out of it. So that's kind of the journey that, eventually got me here. And I love it. I love my job. I love what I get to do every day. And kind of looking back at the journey.
Something that you said there, and we have a lot of commonality in our experiences, especially the career path, when you talk about just the point of where this was going to take you, because I've always been good at foreign languages. And at first, that's what I thought it was. It was just, okay, I'm good at it, so I'm going to stick with it. Because
Yeah.
I used to always study dictionaries, read books. Like when I was a kid, I didn't want toys. I wanted books. I was the only child for a few years. And then my sister came along about 3.5 years later. But I was still pretty much, I was characterized as a bookworm, I guess, in the family. Like I've
Yeah,
always
me
been
too. Me
that
too.
one
Always had my
odd.
nose in the book.
And so it just kind of kept going from there. And it it hit me just one day that this could be a career. But I think a lot of people don't see it that way. They do, as you mentioned, they don't think that you can speak a different language and actually analyze text. And
Right.
because no one even knows what we does have the time. Like the questions I get. So you teach basic level Spanish classes, right, Sarah? You teach basic level Spanish,
I
right,
did.
Kiko?
Yeah.
They don't see it beyond that though. That's all they see it is. You can't do anything with Spanish language, right? And it's like once they realize, no, we're speaking a language and we're within that world, like you would be reading Harry Potter or anything else. And it
Hmm.
just blows people's minds that no, it's more than just a language, it's every culture, sociology, everything that you can do with the language, with an
Hmm.
experience. And
Hmm.
like you said, with the gender influence, your own personal backgrounds, our socioeconomic backgrounds, our racial backgrounds, all that stuff goes into it. It's not just simply in a Spanish class teaching a basic level. It's the human experience as a whole, and I don't think people quite grasp that outside of our field.
Exactly. Yeah, and
Mm-hmm.
there's so much you can do with the degree. I mean, I ended up doing, what one would call a more traditional route where I just went from the undergraduate to the master's to the PhD, and then, straight into teaching college level. I taught Spanish, coordinated a Spanish program, and then moved into, I got a Fulbright award. So I went to Brazil for a year and then secured my second job, which is the one that I'm at now, which is teaching Black studies and Latin American studies, mostly teaching in English, teaching electives to students in the Bronx. And, they don't have very many faculty who are trained in both Latin American studies and Africana studies
Mm-hmm.
in the US at all. And it's becoming, a large demographic group that needs to be recognized and taught about and taught with, and I love getting into the literature with my students because everything that I put in front of them, they've already witnessed, they've already lived it. So um, I'm learning from them a lot, a lot more than,
What
I,
exactly? What do you mean by that for the audience? You say you're learning from the students through the literature itself. Like, what do you mean by that exactly?
so for example, when we read a testimonio from Cuba, Life of Reita, um, I don't have to explain to them what internal colonization is. They get it, they've lived it, they have, a long list of examples. So what we get to do is talk about how it affects us, how do we enact, um, act out in our internal colonization with family members or in our communities, and how can you break that down and heal from it and transform it. So that's because they're all Black Latinx students, they're from the Dominican Republic or Their parents are from the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rican, diaspora, or from the island, and Jamaican, and then we also have like African immigrants. So there's just so many different groups. And there's another class that I taught that was Afro-Latinx, who are Afro-Latinx, and we looked at the history of people of African descent in Latin America. So and then we talked about, what is this category Afro-Latinx? Because, there is a lot of people who are Afro-Latinx, but the category itself for Afro-Hispanic doesn't really make sense because they could be coming from a part of the Caribbean that's not Spanish speaking. Or maybe that's just part of their heritage. And some students will bring up, just like the Latin part just doesn't make sense. Like, where is Latin even coming from? So, and then there's Brazil. So we have these conversations at a very deep level through what we're reading in terms of literature. So it's like the text is a platform, and it allows us to engage in topics. And also it allows us to think about, I always encourage my students to think about, let's look at the way it's written. Like, what are some choices that the writer made, or in a testimonial, what are some choices that the storyteller made, and the person who's transcribing made, to create a narrative, and what impact does that narrative have? The way Michelle Obama wrote Becoming, there's a very clear structure there. The first thing that comes to mind for me when I look at it is there's a large percentage of that text that is not about her. It's about her husband, and it's about, that administration. And, what were the choices behind that? And for me, it's never about putting down a specific text or, critiquing it in a negative way. I like to get inspired from Patricia Hill Collins and Toni Morrison, The Bluest Eye, and Patricia Hill Collins and Black Feminist Thought, that let's think about the overarching system, the greater logic that we're functioning in, and how a particular person or a particular text is reflective of that logic, right? So one way to approach literature in general, but I'll just keep going with this example of Becoming, is, well, what does that say about the overall system? The market that this book is trying to cater to, the particular society, the time that the book was published, and let's think about what would be the strategy behind making those choices.
Right.
So those are some things that I try to engage my students in when we talk about literature.
Okay. I was thinking about something that you mentioned earlier. You talked about the moment that you discovered magic realism mágico. When did it first come to you with the whole Afro-Diasporic, with our spiritualities and our histories? At that point, when you discovered magic realism, was that already in your forefront, or did that come down the road?
Oh, that's a great question. No, way later down the road. Not until I took classes with Jerome Branch at the University of Pittsburgh. And that's, I think that was like the first African American studies class I took was at the University of Pittsburgh too, an Afro-Caribbean dance class. No, it was never really on my radar to think about race in that way. It was a little bit in, when I was reading on Sardua and thinking about border thinking, but not from a Black studies perspective. So later on, as I developed like the final phase of my dissertation, I think is when I started to see that I could speak to the trauma of people of African descent in general, instead of, and racialize it instead of just talking about trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And really anchor the approach to analyzing text to reflect spiritual practices of African diasporic religions. And then that also came through as I revised the dissertation into a book. And I got feedback from peer reviewers on the manuscript, and they helped me really anchor my approach to Black studies, right? To African diasporic religion studies, to concepts from, Yoruba practices, which is a part of the culture that's of the African diaspora in Latin America that you'll see mostly in Brazil, I want to say. It's also, people might have heard Yoruba as a language.
Mm-hmm.
And candomblé would be the religious practice that's associated with that culture. And then there's Santeria, that's mostly practiced, a religious practice that's mostly practiced in Cuba. And then Vodun, which would be the equivalent that's mostly practiced in Haiti. I'm just putting in very basic terms here. And so that's when I started to look more specifically at different deities from those religious systems and how they were showing up in the literature, and started to look more at, and I think these were things that I knew of intuitively. If we connect truly with ourselves, with our spirit, as people of color, there's information that starts to come up that can't be denied, that it's there. You can learn it intellectually, you can learn it intuitively, but I believe it's in your heart, it's in your soul, it's undeniably a part of who you are, and you have access to it. So I was starting to make those connections, like, oh, this is a way that I've already seen and experienced the world, but I didn't know that it came from a whole African diaspora culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's a journey, right? It's a process of getting a better understanding of, this centuries long history and culture that I was never taught about up until, I was in the PhD program.
But I mean, just there's so many levels to this, because we're talking about just strictly within academia, and I think it's interesting. Like you have Afro-American culture, which is a part of the broader diaspora, but Afro-American culture is very different from Afro-Latin American culture or cultures.
Yeah.
And then you have the African subcontinent culture, which is, you
Yes.
can't put it in any sort of a box. You can't put any of this stuff really in a box. But
No.
I guess the most perplexing thing for me, navigating this experience and continuing to do so, is I sense this disconnect between, especially U.S. Blacks with the larger diaspora, especially when it comes to some of the culture issues we're talking about now, language, religion, spirituality. And I don't know if that's because we're so influenced here. We're in such an insular box when it comes to Hollywood and the way Afro culture is portrayed through the lens of white people, especially. I mean, if you look at voodoo, the way voodoo is portrayed in Hollywood is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, the way they just pinpoint and stereotype and mock, basically they're mocking our origins, really. I mean, you know, during the Middle Passage, and you know, that's what people had before they came over, before they were forced over. That's what they had, was their spirituality. And and for them to just sort of mock it now, and people not have any idea at all what their culture is. Like I see Black people constantly um shying away from those images, you know, because they're told that that is a negative association, even though that's from the larger culture. And this is crazy. I'm an atheist teaching my students this stuff, and they're like, Kiko, like, are you serious about this? I'm like, yeah. It's like it's an absolute brainwashing. Like this is part of our culture, you know, and people, the young generations, everyone is still just kind of going along with the but that's not cool to be associated with. And I'm saying to myself, so okay, I'm telling you that that's more real than the stuff that you're practicing. And I'm not trying to make judgment. I'm just saying you're following a Protestant white religion as opposed to the religion that was part of your experiences before we came over. Like, does that make any sense to you at all? And people are just, they don't know how to comment. They can't counter you because they're confused when you say stuff like that, because no one has ever confronted them and told them, do you realize that that's part of the larger culture itself? Do you get these kind of interactions with people who maybe not be in academia, or maybe people within academia think like this? I don't know, but that's kind of been my experience with people who aren't studying these types of things. They just have this attitude that's very degrading towards Afro religion and spirituality.
I mean, I think, yes, whether I have those interactions or not, it is there, you know, and it's important to talk about it and to name it, and come back to, you know, why is it that that this behavior is okay, right? The degrading of a certain culture at the benefit of another, you know, and that's a colonial practice. So that's what was put in place as the continent that we're living on started to get into the phase of, you know, the brutal violence and objectification of people in order to have a specific population thrive, right? So originally it was the indigenous people, and they were depicted as barbaric or noble, which you can see in, you know, the letters of Christopher Columbus, which
Oh
is something,
God, yeah.
you know, I love to look at with students so that they see, you know, where that narrative comes from. And, you know, it's 500 years. You know, and even before that, there was the Moors against, you know, so there's always been this need to, you know, be better than and vilify the other. And I think for me, it's important to just understand where the person is coming from, and allow them to have whatever understanding and belief that, you know, they choose to have. And in my classes, to just invite students, if they're not comfortable with talking about practices of Santeria in Cuba, because they firmly believe that it will get in the way of, of their relationship with God, you know, that it will put them in danger. You know, I can only invite them. It's kind of like you know, when you do a mindfulness practice, you can't force anyone to develop a life of a lifestyle of mindfulness, you can't even force someone to meditate. All you can do is invite them. And if they so choose, you know, they get to participate. And you know, and like you're saying, I think we do have this duty of educating people about the culture that this is. It's as much a culture as Judeo-Christian practices are. And it's part of our, you know, human history, you know, it's part of Black history, definitely. But it's just part of our world. And why not? Why not get to know all of the different cultures that make up the Americas? And just to go back on like the other, it's not an antithesis that you brought up, but like the different ramifications, you know, that make up the diaspora today. I really like how you broke that down. I think it's the same colonial history that's prevented us from getting to know each other hemispherically and transatlantically. So and imperialism and capitalism has played a role in this too. So everyone gets to read Michelle Obama's book, you know, but who's going to read Francia Marquez's book? You know, and those of you who don't know who Francia Marquez is she's, you know, the first Black woman vice president. She's written a letter to Kamala Harris. Maybe Vice President Kamala Harris has responded now. This was years ago, and she didn't hear back. You know, and so like, are we all going to read Francia Marquez's book? No, because it's just the way our world works. You know, there's an empire, and then there's satellites around the center, you know, and you know, we can call it out all day. We can recognize that it's there, and then figure out, you know, what's our role going to be in that. So my role in that is to try to connect as much as I can with contacts that I have in Latin America, and then just let people know, you know, when I'm in a faculty meeting, I let them know, you know, Francia Marquez is campaigning, and I, you know, when I'm in a room with, you know, different, you know, scholars, and they haven't heard of her, you know, I share her hashtag so they can start looking into it. And I rejoice when I see Snoop Dogg sharing, you know, on social media about her campaign. I mean, that was such a big deal.
What is the book that she wrote? So our
No,
audience can.
she hasn't written a book yet, but
Okay,
you know, I'm
I
just
got you.
thinking hypothetically. Yeah, no.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Gosh, you had me hype. I was like, is this a real thing? Like that?
I mean, now I'm gonna look into it. I don't think she has time to write a book right now, but probably will. Yeah.
It's
So yeah, those forces are, you know, at work, and they affect our relationships. They affect our way of the way we see people, and you know, and they get in the way. And that, you know, hearing that someone can call another culture you know, vile or satanic, it hurts, you know, because ideally I would like to see the possibility of people coming together to discuss and see the value in our differences rather than just isolating ourselves, you know. And that holds me accountable. Like, who am I isolating myself from in terms of, you know, within the Black community? It's not easy. It's an uncomfortable place to be in, to try to understand and be compassionate and open.
I think it's crazy. This reminds me of 2016 when I was at Pellissippi Community College while I was still at UT Knoxville. and I taught at Pellissippi Community College in Knoxville in the summers.
Mm,
And it was the first time I taught about Santeria to my students at a community college. And I've noticed that at community colleges, you have more autonomy as far as what you can teach. And when
mm,
you go to UT, they have the syllabi already planned for you. You teach the shit that they have on there for you. And I'm
right.
just saying to myself, I'm such a rebel as it is. I mean, I'm just looking at that. I'm just like, are you kidding me? Like I got 10 years of teaching experience at the time going in, and
Mm,
you want me to teach some pre-planned, stuff that you
mm,
already have there. I just can't do it in my heart because they say let's meet the culture standards, communication culture standards. Okay, I'm speaking Spanish to them. Okay, so let me teach the culture I want to teach them and not the stuff that you have picked already for me to teach. And let me use my experience and maybe enrich it a little bit more. And maybe the students can have better reception. And that's exactly what happened. I taught
yeah,
Santeria. I wasn't going to do it at first because why? I felt the internal colonial pressure that you talked about before, because I've been told, don't do it, Kiko. I got one side of my brain saying, Kiko, don't teach them
right.
Santeria. But I was like, you know what? Screw it. I'm going to do it anyway, because this is my classroom. And it had an amazing reception. I had
Yeah.
Black students in there, white students in there, East Tennessee. A lot of these people didn't have any exposure to this type of information.
Mm,
And I was like, you know what? Well, that worked out well. Guess what I'm going to do next? I'm going to maybe slip in some indigenous culture that I want to talk about. And then I did this and that. I was like, okay, well, let me talk about some LGBTQ Puerto Rican stuff that I have, that I wanted, to incorporate into it. And one thing led to another. And it was amazing. But it's like, we're not necessarily encouraged to do that kind of stuff.
mm,
Even though we're in this field of open-mindedness apparently, but
mm,
it's one of those things that I push all the professors who are listening to this or who will listen to go against the grain. I mean, it's not always about sticking to conformity. Like the whole point of this podcast is to sort of tell people you can be outside of the box without messing up everything, but you can disrupt the system within your own interpretation. And I don't see anything wrong with that. I'm not worried about losing a job over it. If I'm going to lose a job over that, then at least I was authentic with myself, because
mm.
I taught culture within the confines of Latin America. I don't understand that stuff, but you get that mixed messaging. And you may have had those experiences yourself before you became associate professor, where you were conflicted about teaching certain information. Have you ever had that happen to you?
Um, oh yeah, this was earlier on in my teaching career. Not so related to Black studies or Afro-Latin American studies, but I would teach 9/11 in Chile.
Mm.
And there's a YouTube video that's no longer available on YouTube.
Oh, I bet.
And it was just a very shocking way of presenting a historical event that had happened decades before uh, 9/11 was part of, the history in the United States. It had already been a part of American history, but in Chile. And some students would embrace it, and other students would just, they were confused or um, offended that we would look at the history of, another country. It also gave, the perspective that I invited my students to explore was the role that the United States and France and England, and different countries played in the coup in 9/11 in 1973 in Chile.
Hmm.
We wouldn't go in depth in it because it was like for my elementary Spanish classes. So going into that type of exploration on a day like 9/11, of course that was hard for some students to follow. It's so drastically different from a patriotic approach to 9/11. So yeah, another time when I taught at Lehman was we watched a film. I can't remember which one. I think it might have been maybe City of God,
Okay.
or maybe something else. And students just couldn't. I can't remember what it was exactly, but I had students who became very concerned about their well-being because of what culture they were being exposed to. Like that what I was referencing earlier, that it was getting in the way of, their sanctity.
Wow. Like the life of the favelas or something?
No, there was like a ritual that was presented in the film, and they didn't want to be exposed to it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And
Mm.
again, to me, it's now looking back, I just have a lot more understanding around that than I might have at the time. And it just reminds me of another instance when I was in Brazil on the Fulbright. I was with Miriam Alves, who's a poet from Brazil that um, who's published tons of books. If you want to look her up, her last name is Alves. And she's really getting off the ground. I mean, I like to call her the Audre Lorde of Brazil.
Oh, wow.
You
That's
know,
that's high praise.
but we know like how Audre Lorde is more known now than when she was alive, which happens a lot. Zora Neale Hurston happened to her too.
Mm-hmm.
So she's somewhat well known, but deserves a lot more uh, exposure. So Miriam Alves, I was with her in somewhere in the north of Sao Paulo in one of the hoods up there. And we went to meet up another poet, Raquel Almeida, who's also phenomenal. Almeida, Almeida, Raquel. Um, and Raquel was doing a spoken word event with her collective that's called oh my gosh, Elo da Corrente. Yeah. And they were doing a spoken word event in a public library. And the way they start their spoken word events is always with a drum, calling in uh spirits and bringing the ashe into the room, which is just
Mm-hmm.
for spirit, and connecting with ancestors. And they explain, why they're using the drum, because there's children in the audience and adults in the audience that don't know the meaning of having a hand drum, which a lot of people don't know. It brings in an energy to the space and allows a community to connect with um, ancestors and ancestral memory in a way that you cannot without the drum. So they would start playing the drum, they would start chanting a few simple songs, and a couple of people just walked out.
Mm-hmm.
And when they were doing the sign of the cross, and they couldn't be in that space.
Wow.
And that's the power of the legacy of colonialism, that
Mm-hmm.
you know um that there's a large chunk of the Black population that isn't getting access to this part of ancestral culture, because there's another culture that's taught them that they can't, that if they do, uh, they're going to get lost. When from what I have lived, and I can only speak from my experience, I can't like preach this to anyone else. It's quite the opposite. It's like I get connected with myself and I am found, and I get to drink water and like plant roots, and that I just wouldn't be able to without that access to ancestral memory. And it's interesting for me because I could say like it's not even my culture. Like my mom is from Madagascar, but it is, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was the memory that I recalled about the library. And yeah, they left, and they like, I think one of them had a child and was like, held their child by the hand and did the sign of the cross. And I was like, oh, and I was thinking, oh, in Brazil, everyone's gonna be playing drums and doing the chants and this, I just had this exotic image. But no, there's division, and there's tension, and there's heterogeneity there too. And it can be heartbreaking, but I think it's just real. And I don't want to say beautiful, but it's part of our reality. We
Mm-hmm.
are, as the African diaspora, we always have been a heterogeneous, beautiful community. Yeah,
And
I'm so excited. I love this project for you. I wanted to make sure this is included in the episode. I really want to congratulate you on the 15 episodes.
yes, thank you.
Excited to see what you're doing with everything that you've learned, and the way that you're, contributing to the community. I think this is just a great resource for so many different people to have access to. And I'm really excited for you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that so much. But
Yeah.
well, audience, we will continue this second part at a later time. And good evening, beautiful people, and goodbye, beautiful people. Talk to you soon.
Yes.